Hi, welcome to Understanding Shochu, brought to you by JSS, the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association. My name is Don Lee. I'm probably most well known for being the guy who put bacon and bourbon in an old fashioned at a bar called PDT about 15 years ago. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the category of shochu because I was really fortunate enough to visit Japan with some bartenders you may also recognize in this photo and visit a bunch of different distilleries and take a deep dive into this category. Unfortunately, prior to going to Japan, I thought I knew what shochu was. I certainly knew the top line items. I'd taken tests, I'd studied up, but I didn't really understand what it was all about or how I should be thinking about this, and better yet, how I can explain this to others until I had the opportunity to actually visit Japan. So today, JSS has asked me to come here and explain what I learned on this trip to you today. Unfortunately, we have great deal of information on the internet, but also not necessarily the best information that's in a way that is easily understood or meaningful if you just went to Google and looked up something like what is shochu. Most likely, you're going to go to something like Wikipedia and you're going to be fed a lot of information. Some of it is going to be correct, it's going to be useful, but it's not actually going to tell you the real story about what the category is or really tell you how you should think about it. If you took this basic information and you said, hey, this is a distilled spirit, it's made from some stuff, it comes at some ABV, this is really unsatisfying. And if you were to look at another category that you probably know very well, such as whiskey, and took that same Wikipedia article, you would also get as just an unsatisfying list of facts about it that doesn't really tell you anything about how to think about that category. If a customer came to your bar today and said, hey, I want to know more about whiskey. I drink a lot of vodka, I drink a lot of gin, but I don't really understand whiskey. How do I think about this? What should I try? I'm sure you'd have a lot of different ways to explain it to them, but you wouldn't start with that it's distilled and it's just made from grain and put in wood. You'd probably start with something a little bit more detailed. So just saying that you can look at the information from something like Wikipedia and have that top line, it is made from something, doesn't give you enough information. Most likely, if you're going to explain some kind of whiskey to somebody, you probably start with where it's from. Maybe, let's say we're going to talk about American whiskeys. So you're going to pour them some bourbon, you're going to pour them some rye, and say, hey, try these two things. Let me show how they're different. When you're explaining a category like whiskey, it makes sense to have some kind of framework to help you think about it yourself and to explain it to others. And for most of us in the spirits industry as bartenders, we tend to think about it in terms of a couple of different variables that, depending on what specific product you're talking about, we can pick and choose the different variables to say, here's how it is unique and different, but also here are the different categories that these variables live in so that we can think about the category as a whole. So for whiskey, let's say we can think about it as the location. There's Scotch whiskeys, which we can subdivide up into, let's say, the Highlands and the Lowlands or the Islands. There are American whiskeys, which we obviously can talk about rye and bourbons, or corn whiskeys, or mixed grain whiskeys. Lots of different subdivisions, but we can talk about the location of where they're from. That's most often the simple way of saying what this category is. After that, within that category, we can say, what is it made from? So in whiskey, we're talking about different grains. And then we can also say, how is it distilled? Is this a blended product? Is this a continuously distilled product? Is this a single pot still product? Is this a single malt? And then nowadays, a lot of people put a lot of emphasis in what kind of oak was it put in, how was it aged, and then there's lots of other factors we can think about when something like whiskey. This is pretty easy, and this is how we can think about a lot of other categories. We can look at this and we can say, hey, we can use the same framework to look at other categories such as brandy, where we say, okay, locations are still locations. Maybe the terms are different, but a location is a location. Ingredient wise, we're looking at different kinds of fruit distillates. And after that, it's still about distillation and how you do it and the how you age it, how you mix it together, and then how you bottle it. Even when you come to something that's a little bit different like rum, and there's so many different kinds of products made all over the place, you can still use broadly these same variables. So, for the most part, when we think about any of the products in our back bar, we tend to use the same set of variables And it almost becomes like this game that, you see children playing where they're trying to fit a shape into a puzzle. Does the circle go in the circle? Does it go into the square? And we're just trying to match and see where things go. If we try to use this same framework and look at how does shochu fit, it doesn't actually work. And unfortunately, we need to look at things that aren't really a part of these other categories. So today I'll be breaking down shochu into the following variables for you and explain what they are and how they differ from other categories and how they tell the true story about shochu. So the one thing that is going to really be the same that we're going to start for every category is we're going to talk about location. But this is going to be a little bit deeper than just the basics of, hey, shochu is a Japanese product. Because unfortunately, even though that is true and it is one of the most important parts of what shochu is, it doesn't really mean very much because for most of us, Japan as a concept isn't much other than it's some islands in Asia. There's a city called Tokyo. Maybe it gets leveled by Godzilla. Maybe you remember that The Simpsons went there, or maybe you grew up with something like Hello Kitty. Or, depending on your generation, maybe you have some kind of relationship with the media of Japan and you think you remember that part of Japan. Most of us, whether or not we grew up with any kind of Japanese media, certainly have an idea of what the food and drink culture of Japan is, whether or not that's actually true. And just as the food and drink culture of America can't be distilled down to just hamburgers and Jack Daniels, obviously Japan is not all just sushi and sake. So when we think about Japan, we need to look at it with a little more nuance. Take the United States as an example. Because of the cultural dominance in the United States across the world, but certainly for those of us living there, we know a lot more about it and we can name a lot more subdivisions of the United States. Certainly we know that there are many different states. You can probably name many different cities there. When you think about Japan, how many cities in Japan outside of Tokyo can you really think about? Without having a deeper understanding of what Japan is, we don't really have the vocabulary to think about shochu yet. And this isn't your fault. This is something that we all have. As somebody who lived in New York for over 20 years, we tended to ignore everything across that river. Yeah, New Jersey's there. I know it's a state. It's the Garden State, but really, do I ever think about it? In fact, it's such a joke that the New Yorker made a joke about it on their cover back in the 70s. So it only stands for reason that wherever you live, you know very well, and even just shortly outside the boundaries of where you live, you don't really pay attention to. So unless you're from Japan, have Japanese ancestry, you visited Japan, it just is kind of this amorphous blob of a place that's somewhere else. So when we think about something like bourbon, we very often think of a place. For better or for worse, we associate it with a place. And so let's try to do that with Japan and think a little bit more deeply about what we know about Japan and how that can inform shochu. As we said, for most of us, we really only think of Tokyo in Japan. And it's a shame because while it is the capital, it is super important, it really doesn't mean too much. Maybe some of you have been watching Formula One and you now know that there's a Japanese Grand Prix, but where in Japan is that? Well, if you're curious, Suzuka is right here. It's actually not too far from Tokyo, but it's a bit out there. So if you wanted to visit, it's not, an easy day trip from Tokyo. So how can we think about Japan? Well, let's look at these divisions. So in the United States, we have states, and if we went a little bit further down, you have counties, you have cities. Likewise, with Japan, let's start breaking it down into smaller parts. So Japan is an archipelago. It's a series of islands, and those islands can be broken up into regions, here color-coded for you. That is kind of like a state in the way that we think of it in the United States. And within those colored regions, we have smaller areas which are called provinces. Those provinces, or prefectures, are more like the counties in the Western sense. So let's think about the island Japan, and where does shochu come from if it's not just the entire country? Well, you'd be very surprised to learn it actually comes from one very specific place. It comes from here, this southern island called Kyushu. So when we talk about shochu, we really shouldn't say that it comes from Japan, because it doesn't come from the rest of Japan. It really comes from this one place, which is Kyushu. And what does Kyushu look like? Let's take a little bit more zoomed in photo. And it, besides being an island, also is a series of prefectures. And each of those prefectures are going to be very different. Now, when we think about something like bourbon, we say, okay, well, technically it isn't, based on the fact that it comes from Kentucky, but we all largely associate it with Kentucky. And we say, okay, well, where does the word bourbon come from? Well, technically it has to do with the Bourbon Dynasty, but a lot of people think maybe it has to do with Bourbon Street in New Orleans or Bourbon County in Kentucky. There's maybe not the most correct answer, but there's an idea. And you understand that there are these places in the US that could have the origin of bourbon. Well, when it comes to shochu, well, where does that word come from, and how do we know it comes from Kyushu? Well, the oldest written word, shochu, comes from a shrine in Kagoshima, which is one of the provinces of Kyushu. It is located right about here, and inside the eaves of the shrine, the woodwork is actually quite impressive, and it's made without any nails. This was built originally in the 1100s and then rebuilt in the 1500s. And at that time, when they were building these beams, they were put together without any nails, as I said, and they would join them with a piece of wood. And as you can see here, to show you those two different parts of the beam being put together by that, what looks like a toothpick going through, imagine that piece of wood that goes in the middle. That is not going to be seen by anybody. And the beams are much more complex than this. It actually has many different pieces. And one of the carpenters who happened to be working on rebuilding this shrine in the 1500s said, I'm angry at the monks here because they're a bunch of cheapskates. They didn't give us anything to drink. And so he wrote his displeasure on one of those pieces of wood that gets slid between two pieces of a beam that no one would ever see, not expecting anyone to see it. A piece of graffiti, if you will, from the 1550s. And it was dormant there for over 500 years, until more recently it was unearthed as the temple was being rebuilt one more time. And we found the first written example of the word shochu. Super interesting, lots of fun, and that comes from Kyushu. So we can update our definition of where shochu comes from just being a widely, the country of Japan, to the more specific Kyushu. But we want to go a little bit more deeper. And as our example, let's think about when we think of bourbon and we think of Kentucky and where specifically it comes from and why it comes from there. Let's think about why shochu comes from Kyushu. Why is it only this place? Why not the rest of Japan? To answer that question, let's take a step back and let's look at maps in general and just think about how we think of the world. So for most of us today, we probably go to Google for our map, and this is how we think of the world. Why is the world drawn this way? Well, fortunately, there has to do with a long history of settlers from Europe who decided to do it that way. There's a C word that probably you don't want to get into because it's too political, but it's not like bars are putting it on their walls and, deifying it. But if the world is round and looks like this from space, and no, it's not flat, and if you're a flat earther, you can please leave. If it's round, how do we get a map that looks like this? Well, that's because it would be very difficult to walk around with a globe in your pocket. Round, it's big, and if you actually wanted to look at it, it'd have to be very big. So imagine carrying a bunch of spheres and trying to look at where you're going. Very impractical. Much more practical if you have something flat, something you can fold up, and so you can keep it with you, you can travel with it, you can draw lines on it, you can figure out where you're going. So if you wanted to do that with something that's round, well, what's one way you can take something round and turn it into something flat? For those of us behind the bar, well, we do it all the time when we peel an orange, say. So you could peel the globe and come up with a map, but if you did it in this spiral way, it probably wouldn't be so useful. So maybe we do it in segments. And if you took that segment and you flattened it out, you could get a map. Unfortunately, the pointy bits aren't that useful, so what they ended up doing in the 1500s was taking that globe, turning it into a cylinder, and then unrolling that cylinder. So what they're doing is they're taking those pointy bits, they're making them wider so that they become all squared around the edges, and then rolling them out. Interestingly, the this form of map, the mercantile projection, was done in the 1550s, done in the same year actually that this carpenter wrote this piece of graffiti in Kagoshima. So, going back to this map, if you look at this, there's something not quite right. It's not a bunch of perfect squares, but by the equator, you can see that every square is a little bit more squarish, but they become more rectangular and then widely long compared to the middle as you get further away from the equator. So when you look at a map like this, or let's say a map of Europe like this is a gross over exaggeration of the areas further away from the equator. If we were to draw this map again and show what the true size of these countries are within this border, you get something that looks like this. So as you see, the further away you get from the equator, the more blown up those places look like. Now, you could say that there may be reasons why people who drew this map wanted to make certain places look bigger than others. Perhaps maybe it was just because it was the easiest way to do it. At the time, they didn't have, computers to do fancy computer drawings, and so if they're doing it by hand, this was just the easiest way to do it. But the fact remains that things are out of proportion. And in fact, the places that get the shortest shrift are the places right by the equator, places like Africa. So, as a simple example, just how big is Africa? Well, Africa is so big that you can fit all of the US, China, India, and all of Europe inside of it. In fact, if we just look at the UK versus the island of Madagascar, Madagascar is actually much bigger than the entire UK and Ireland. In fact, if you put the UK and Ireland together, it would only make up 70% of the island of Madagascar. So what we think of maps is a little bit false. And so if we want to get a better representation of the way the world looks, maybe we look at a different kind of map. A map like this, where instead of forcing those edges of that orange to become square, we leave them round and we get a much more representative view of the world. And there are many other ways you can look at the map that are less useful but perhaps more artistic. Let's say if you cut the world into a bunch of triangles, you get something that looks like this. And at this point, you're probably asking yourself, why is Don talking about maps when I came here to hear about Shochu? Well, the reason is because when we look at these maps and we look at Japan versus the rest of the world, it's kind of hard to understand how big it is and where it is and how it relates to the rest of the world. So when we look at Japan and where it lies with the rest of the world or how big it is, we would get a better sense of what Japan is like if you've not been there. So when we look at a map just like this in isolation, it doesn't tell us too much. So let's look at Japan and let's compare it to some other places to get a sense of what Japan is and where it is and how big it is. So first of all, to answer that question of how big is Japan, well, compared to the UK and Ireland, quite big. Compared to all of Europe, it is quite big. And if we were to lay it across from tip to tip, it is very long indeed. If we were to look at just the island of Kyushu as an example, because that is in fact what we're going to be talking about the most as the home of Shochu, how big is Kyushu? Kyushu is about half the size of South Carolina if you're from the United States, and if you're more European, well, it's about half the size of the island of Ireland. And when we look at where does Japan fit in the world without moving it around, well, it fits at about this latitude. So if you can see on the edge of the map, we have both Japan compared to Europe and Japan where it actually is. And you can see that it goes from about the middle of France down to Western Sahara, the disputed land south of Morocco. And if we were to look at that in relation to the United States, it pretty much goes from the top of Maine all the way down to the bottom of Florida. So it is a very long piece of land, and you can imagine quite a bit different climate and topography as you get from the top to the bottom of Japan. Just like these other places in the world, you probably have a much better understanding of what it might like to be in those places. So, in talking about Japan, let's talk again about various landmarks and let's try to orient ourselves within Japan. So, here's Tokyo, the city that we all know and love, that perhaps loved a little too much by Godzilla. And as mentioned earlier, this is Suzuka, where the Japanese Grand Prix takes place. But when we look at this island of Kyushu, which has this Hachima shrine, which the oldest definition of Shochu, we also have this other set of islands down here. And those are called the Ryukyu Islands, which are also part of Japan. This is the least well-known part of Japan, and it goes all the way down almost to Taiwan. And really, once you get towards the bottom, it has a climate more like the Philippines than what you probably imagine Japan is like. This is going to become important, but if, let's say, this is still a little too abstract for you and you need a more modern day example of how you can think about Japan, well, perhaps when you saw this map, you saw this red region and you saw the word Kanto, and that rings a bell in your head. What is Kanto? What does that remind you of? And maybe it reminds you of that's actually the name of the region of the original Pokemon games. And although they did not use the real names of the rest of the regions, in the next series of Pokemon games that came out for the Game Boy Advance in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, those took place in what they called the Hoenn region, but actually that was modeled on Kyushu. So even if you look at the map from the game, and let's say we rotate this so that it actually looks like what it really looks like in the world, or actually before, let's point out these two different places. Here's two different volcanoes I want you to look at, and then let's rotate that. And you can see against the actual map of Kyushu, there is Mount Aso. That is that large volcano in the middle. And then if you look further down, you're going to see this smaller volcano. And that is a volcano that you can see actually from downtown Kagoshima. And it is true to both the reality of Kyushu as well as the Pokemon region. So if you were ever wondering what Professor Oak versus Professor Birch drank, the answer I can tell you is Professor Oak would drink sake and Professor Birch would be drinking shochu because he is, in fact, from Kyushu. Coming back to the real world and where things are, if we orient ourselves again, looking at Tokyo, where's Tokyo compared to the rest of the world? Tokyo, compared to in, let's say, Europe and Africa, is about the same latitude as the capital of Tunisia. Or in the US, it would be just below Virginia. So northern North Carolina, just south of Virginia. And you can see on this map here where that would go across the rest of the world. And when we're looking at specifically Kyushu, we're looking at about Morocco, when looking at Europe and Africa, and in the US, we're looking at about South Carolina. And when we're talking about those Ryukyu Islands, as we said, in the US, we're looking at about Florida, and when we're talking about in Europe and Africa, we're talking about the Western Sahara, the disputed territory south of Morocco. So when we're talking about this place, and we want to talk about what are they making shochu from, you're probably going to say rice, and makes sense. It is the predominant grain, the starch of Japan. It's a thing that sake is already made from, but I'm going to ask you to hold off on that for a second, and let's think about this ingredient more than the specific what it is, but think about how the ingredient tells a story about the spirit. And again, let's look at bourbon again as our example of another spirit where we can look at the ingredient that tells the story of the product. Many of you probably know that the history of bourbon has to do with the fact that after the US became its own country and its independence, the first war that was fought was over taxation of alcohol. And at the time, the people who were living in those original colonies in the area around Pennsylvania and Maryland, they were primarily producing rye. That was the grain that they had brought with them from the old world. They were tended to be folks of Germanic descent, and they were growing rye in this relatively colder part of the US. Now, as you know, bourbon is made from corn and not from rye. And as you also know, corn these days isn't grown so much in this region, but somewhere else. So, where is rye actually grown from? Well, if we look on a map a little bit deeper, uh, we're going to look at what is the grain producing regions of the US today. And you can see that corn is grown further inland. And as we all know, as I mentioned, there was this thing known as the Whiskey Rebellion, where it was the first war that the US fought, where George Washington had to put together an army and he had to put down this rebellion so that he could get people to pay taxes. And where did those people who didn't want to go pay taxes do? They moved over to Kentucky. At that time, Indian country, an area that wasn't a state, that wasn't a place yet. And so they felt that they can get away from the government, not pay taxes. And when they got there, they decided that, well, what can we grow out here? And what they could grow out there, it turns out, was corn. And when you look at corn production versus historic rye production, rye is such a small part of the US production of grain at this point that it's not even kept on maps. If you went to the US Department of Agriculture and you looked at what is grown in the US, rye isn't even listed. In fact, it's so small. And if you looked at the rest of the world, you can see that rye is listed in a number of places. Whereas corn being something that is very big, something that's produced all over, compared to rye production, it's quite small. Corn is measured in the millions of bushels, rye in the hundreds of thousands. And when you compare that to that historic map I showed earlier, in the 1800s, US was producing 18 million bushels of rye. Today, it's only producing 11. So rye, much like when we talk about the spirit, is not a major part of the US agriculture anymore. So let's think about that, and let's think about, how we think about shochu and where in Kyushu it's from and what shochu is made from. And as we look at that super basic description, yes, rice is going to be on that list because it is a main staple. It is not only the thing that is primarily eaten in Japan as a part of every meal, but it is also something that is so important that they name major anime characters after it. But after rice, if you look, there's a bunch of other stuff that, quite frankly, doesn't seem to have any rhyme or reason. When you look at other spirits like whiskey, all the ingredients tend to be from one family. We have all grains, or in brandies, they're all fruits. In rum, it's all made from sugar, right? So when you look at something like shochu, well, rice, barley, okay, we're still in grain. Sweet potato, not a grain, that's a little weird. Buckwheat, back to grain, okay. Maybe sweet potato was the one odd thing out. But now, sugar? Doesn't that make it more like a rum? I thought we were more like a grain spirit. Chestnut, sesame seeds, potato, carrot. There's actually about 27 different things that shochu can be made from. It can be made from everything from green tea to even tomato. So this is an odd category. It's a little difficult to think about this as a category that's defined by just an ingredient like many of the other categories that we know. So maybe, we can say, let's think about what grows in Kyushu, what grows in Japan, and maybe that'll explain this list. We look at, what is primarily grown in Japan. I mean, rice and barley is there, but none of these other ingredients are on this list. And if we look at where in Japan rice is being produced, we see that it's mostly being produced further north. It's in fact not being produced down in Kyushu. Let's go back to maps then. Maybe maps can tell us something a little bit more. Well, so from a agricultural perspective, while you can grow rice in pretty much everywhere in Japan, rice likes to be grow further north, and it doesn't really grow in that southern area. And when we look at Japan compared to the rest of the world again, and what the climate looks like in those parts, it's not just based on the latitude and what the climate may look like there. And for easy visualization, let's look at the U.S. and a planting zone map. If you are into gardening, you've probably seen something like this, where you can see the zone for different kinds of plants you would grow. while there is a north-south trend in terms of colder as you go north, warmer as you go south, there's actually other things that will determine how things will grow. And if we go back to that earlier map we looked at, we can see that one of the major things that determines where things grow is where mountains are, in fact. And so when we look at Japan, which is an archipelago, a volcanic island that is full of mountains, well, that's going to have a large influence in what grows where. So let's look at Kyushu again. And in this map, we're going to see that it's the different prefectures, but that's not going to be so useful for what we want to look at now. So let's get rid of the colors. Let's keep the name of the prefectures, and let's look at where different things tend to grow. And looking at the main four products that are used for shochu production, we can see that they tend to grow in different regions. So different prefectures will tend to focus on different types of shochu because that's what grows there. And if we look at this compared to a topographic map, you can see that a lot of this will be determined by that geography once again. So that rice producing region, well, part of it has to do with not just the fact that it is a lot of low land, but it's also the area that is most protected. So because it is inside of this bay and a bunch of other islands around the edges, a lot of those ocean air and those storms that are coming up from these other regions are not going to get to that interior part of Kumamoto. So you can grow things like rice that would have a harder time growing up north, where barley, being a much more robust grain, can grow further north, or buckwheat, which can grow as you're facing out to the Pacific Ocean. That lower part of Kyushu, where you mostly see sweet potato, has to do with the fact that it is volcanic soil that's very rocky. So, much like just regular potatoes, instead of having to clean all those fields and remove all the rocks and then irrigate it to grow rice, you can just grow sweet potatoes in rocky soil. So, that southern part of Kyushu is where sweet potato comes from. However, there's one thing missing from this list. Before we move on to that, one other interesting note that does tie back to what we were talking about earlier when we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. An interesting fact is that this centermost part of Kyushu, in the Kumamoto region, there is a part of Kumamoto that is high up in the mountains where there are small protected valleys where they can grow rice. And because it was very difficult for the Japanese government in the Shogun era to get down there to tax people, that is actually where the most rice shochu was produced still to this day. So they have a history of producing rice spirits there because they didn't want to pay taxes. And in Japan, historically, you pay your taxes in rice. And they would see how much taxes you have to pay based on how much rice you produced. So if you could hide your production by turning it into alcohol, you'd have to pay less taxes. And that is something that ties shochu to the Whiskey Rebellion. But what is the thing that is missing that we haven't talked about here yet? And that would be sugarcane, that kind of outlier ingredient that doesn't fit with the rest of them. Well, sugarcane grows in the southern part of Kyushu, or not the Kyushu island, but from the Ryukyu Island, south of Kyushu. And that is a completely different type of shochu, but still a shochu. And when we're looking at the region and we're comparing it to someplace else, you can think of it as the latitude similar to Florida. Florida is, got a lot of ocean around it. It is much further south. It's warm. Sugarcane's going to grow there, and that's why you can imagine sugarcane is going to grow in the Ryukyu Islands of Japan. More specifically, though, if we look at those islands, there's actually two groups of islands, a northern group of islands and a southern group of islands. And when we look at that first northern group of islands in red, those are known as the Amami Islands, and that's actually where most of that sugarcane kokuto shochu comes from. The reason for this is that not only is this an ideal place to grow shochu, there is a history of making this type of brown sugar. So sugarcane is cut, pressed into juice, and then it is boiled in these large cauldrons. And the inside of this is just sugarcane juice that is slowly simmering and then steaming off, and then it's compacted down into these giant bricks. Here, one of the distillers at Amami was showing us these bricks of brown sugar. Sometimes you'll see it listed as black sugar. It's probably more accurate to say that it is a brown sugar. Further south is another group of islands, which is mostly known as the Okinawa Island Group. And for some of you from my generation, you probably know this from the location of Karate Kid 2, where weirdly he had to chop through a bunch of ice to show off his martial prowess. Maybe as bartenders obsessed with large blocks of ice, this can be a competition we can bring up into future cocktail competitions. But in Okinawa, we actually have a older, more indigenous style of shochu. So when you look at how pot distillation came to Japan, there are a couple different theories and a couple different kinds of archaeological evidence that shows the ways in which it may have come. One of those ways is that in these Ryukyu Islands, there is the oldest form of pot distillation that has been found from an archaeological perspective that predates the distillation that you see in Kyushu and then further north. And we do know that continuous distillation does eventually get to Japan, but that comes from a much more northern way in the 19th century. That earliest form of distillation actually came from the south through Southeast Asia and then through the Ryukyu Islands. So when we talk about where does shochu come from, perhaps we need to add a couple more places there. We already had Kyushu as an island, so we could add Ryukyu and Okinawa. But here's where I'm going to have to come clean and say that technically, even though this is called Understanding Shochu, if JSS had their way, they would much prefer if I called this Understanding Honkaku Shochu and Awamori. And you can imagine this is much more complicated and not quite as friendly sounding as just understanding shochu, but it is the correct terminology. So let's take a step back first, now that we understand a little bit more about Japan, and figure out what is this Honkaku Shochu and Awamori. So shochu, broadest way of thinking about the entire category. And then within shochu, we can subdivide it to Honkaku, which is single pot distillation bottled at less than 45 ABV. This implies that there is a non-single pot distillation, which would be called kurui, and that is continuous distillation, column distillation, and all of that tends to be bottled at less than 36% ABV. However, we don't talk about that. Think about this in the way of where tequila. There is 100% blue agave. Love that. There is also mixto, but in the kind of bars that you're going to and going to be working at, probably don't carry it, probably don't talk about it. It exists, it's there. It's not really something that we talk about. And certainly outside of Japan, it's not something that you're really going to see. So don't have to worry about that. So in the world of shochu, we're talking about Honkaku shochu, and then as a more specific category underneath Honkaku shochu, we have Awamori. Awamori specifically is that single pot distilled shochu that comes from the Ryukyu Islands. And it more specifically needs to be made from rice, not the rice that you're thinking of, but it has to be made from indica rice. And the word indica does come from the same root as the other indica, which is India, and it's referring to the type of grain of rice. Now, most people incorrectly refer to this as long grain and short grain rice. Technically, there's both long and short grain rices in the indica and the Japanese style rice family. In the indica rice family, the most common long grain rice that you think of are the Thai style rice and the basmati rice, or jasmine rice and basmati rice, but also includes the Spanish style rice, such as bomba rice, that you would use in making a paella. That is also in the indica family. And in the Japanese style rice family, the short grain rice, as we call it, there are many varieties, but the wild rice, the purple long rice that you often see in health foods, that technically falls under the Japanese style rice category. So when we're talking about Awamori, though, we are talking about, and the rice of Awamori, we're specifically talking about that indica rice. Because, again, this came from Southeast Asia, it came from the rice styles of Thailand and India, and it came through these Ryukyu Islands. Now, the other thing that is mentioned here as being the major differentiator of Awamori is that it has to use specifically black koji. And we're going to get more into koji, and it's going to be the key to really understanding the category. But first, let's go back and let's talk about this map, and let's talk about the specifics of the location and how we should think about it. So if we want to be super specific in the same way that we want to be specific about shochu not just being general shochu but honkaku shochu, we really should talk about the GIs, the geographic indications. Now, if you don't know what a GI is, well, it's probably the easiest comparison is the champagne is only champagne if it comes from Champagne. Otherwise, it's just sparkling wine. The meme that you see that in many forms. Champagne specifically is a most commonly known as an AOC, and for the French-speaking countries or the former colonies of French-speaking countries, that is the style of name controlling that you'll see. So in Martinique, you have an AOC for the type of rum that comes specifically from Martinique. Also used in cheeses such as Vacheron. Other ways of talking about the similar controlling of names, you have the DO, denomination of origin, used for tequila or for sherry. But in Japan, the GI, there are actually 14 different GIs. And most of them, 7 of them, happen to be for sake, but 4 of them happen to be for shochu. The 2 of them happen to be for wine, and 1 of them is for umeshu. Umeshu is a plum distilled spirit infusion. I'm sure if you've had a sweet dessert plum alcoholic beverage at a sushi restaurant, it was probably umeshu. But talking about shochu, there are 4 specific GIs, one of them being the Awamori that is from the Ryukyu Islands, and then 3 others. Other than the specific GIs, which have to come from a place and has other specific rules about how it's produced, the way to think about shochu is mostly the island it's from, more specifically the prefecture it's from, and if you are really going for super bonus points, you can think about the city, but no one's really going to be looking unless you're working in the shochu industry. So this brings us to koji, and koji really is the key to understanding shochu. We mentioned it briefly in talking about awamori and that it's made from black koji, but it really is the key to understanding shochu because it really unlocks this question of how do these ingredients, especially something like sugarcane, really relate to anything else in being a whole category? And we can again think about this in terms of understanding other spirits and the category that we've been looking at for everything else in terms of why bourbon comes from a specific place, or at least we think it comes from a specific place, most commonly associated with a place. And we can say, how can we think about Japan and why shochu comes from a place, and koji being the key to this. And earlier, you thought that I made this joke as to, what Professor Oak versus Professor Birch would be drinking in the main island of Japan versus Kyushu. And this actually is the key to understanding this question of what is koji and why shochu comes from a specific place. So, why did I say that Professor Oak drinks sake as opposed to shochu? Well, if you look at where sake is made, and as a shorthand for where the sake brewers are, let's look at where the sake brew masters guilds are, because there's less of them. There are too many sake breweries to count. So looking at just the guilds, if you look at this map, they tend to all be from one place. And if let's rotate this map so that it looks like all the other maps, and we draw a line right down here, we can see that almost all of them are above the line on that main island of Japan. In fact, only 2 aren't on that main island of Japan. One happens to be in Kyushu as well, because they do also produce sake. But for the most part, sake is made in the north. And we can think about this again in terms of climate and the fact that it is colder the higher up you go, and it is warmer the further south you go. And This becomes more clear when we start looking at Koji. Also, I'm going to start throwing in the words for the main ingredients in Japanese, because you probably will at some point come across these words when you're looking at bottles. So rice is kome, barley is mugi, sweet potato is imo, buckwheat is soba, which is the same word as the buckwheat noodles you've probably seen at some point. And then when we talk about the brown sugar shochu, it is kokuto. But going back to Koji, what is Koji? Well, Koji is what Japanese call aspergillus orzae, and can't really beat around this bush. It is a mold. Uh, on this larger photo, you can see that these are grains of rice that seem to have this kind of fuzzy sweater. And that fuzzy sweater are actually little strands of hair that are from this mold. And in this petri dish, it looks like that it's more green yellow, and there's little powder that in this zoomed in photo you can see is the very tip of those each of those hairs, and that powder is the spores, and that is the mold trying to reproduce. But what looks like a little dust speck, if you were to look even closer on a microscope, is actually hundreds of little specks of these spores. And when we talk about Koji and the color of Koji, what we're talking about is the color of this spore. And some of you, maybe you're feeling a little grossed out because you don't like the idea of eating and drinking mold, but you'll be surprised to learn that all of us have been eating and drinking it quite a bit. And I'm not just talking about if you like, artisanal cheeses. I'm talking about in everyone's everyday diet. There are some Asian ingredients that you probably didn't know come from Koji. Both miso and soy sauce are made with Koji, as is mirin, which is a lesser known ingredient, but everyone, for the most part, uses soy sauce. Most of you probably have had a miso soup or a miso dish, but these are primarily made with Koji. In fact, if you go to the Kikkoman website, they will, proudly tell you that their entire success story is based on the fact that they were the first to do the full genome sequence of the Koji mold, and that it is the miracle seasoning made by microorganisms. So what is this, and how does this relate to the spirit? And for that, let's look at another category and how we think about that category. In this case, let's talk about Scotch whiskey. And here's a way that we can think about the various variables of Scotch. But if somebody came to your bar and they said, "Hey, give me a Scotch," your next question would be, well, what kind? And if they didn't seem like an actual Scotch drinker, you're probably two ways of describing Scotch would be, well, do you want it to be smoky or not smoky, right? And for those of us who work in the bars, we know that that has to do with peat. Well, for those who might not know as much, well, what is peat and what does that have to do with Scotch whiskey? Because it's not part of these main variables when talking about whiskey. Peat is an accumulation of grass, leaves, twigs, branches. It is a bunch of organic matter that has been compacted for hundreds, if not thousands of years over time, and it compresses and it becomes kind of like the top layer that if there was more earth and a mountain pushing down on it would become coal. But because it's on that top layer, it's still loose, crumbly, and moist, and that is called peat. And peat is used in the whiskey making industry in Scotland to burn. And you need to do this because that's where the smoky flavors are going to be coming from. Now, if you're confused as to why burning peat has anything to do with whiskey, we need to take another step back and say, well, okay, how do you make any alcohol? And to make alcohol, we need to take sugar and yeast. And when sugar and yeast has a bit of water and it has a little oxygen, what it's going to do is it's going to almost breathe that oxygen in the same way that we do as a cellular organism. It's going to breathe out carbon dioxide, and as a byproduct, it's going to make alcohol. So all alcohol that you've had from a perspective of drinking alcohol has been made this way. It is technically possible to synthesize alcohol, but it is extremely labor intensive, cost inefficient, and no one does that. Everyone makes alcohol by having yeast and giving it sugar so that the yeast can go through its entire life cycle and produce alcohol as a byproduct. So when we're talking about spirits, other than rum, which is made from sugar, everything else tends to be made from something else. And in talking about scotch, we're talking about it being made from barley. So talking about peat, we're talking about yeast and sugar, but where's the sugar in this list? We're talking about barley. Well, barley, as we all know, it's a grain, and normally if you let it grow, it becomes a grass. But in order to turn barley into alcohol, what we need to do is we need to turn it into a format that yeast can eat. And the answer to that is that there's sugar inside the barley. To be more specific, it isn't sugar yet. It has the potential to become sugar. So inside a barley grain, it's going to be mostly starch. There's also the living embryo part of the seed that becomes the plant. Some fiber, that's the bran, that's the outer edges. There's some protein, the building blocks of the plant as it grows. But for the most part, it is the stored energy the plant will use to become a grass. And so at some point in some class, you probably saw a diagram like this. And if you do gardening, this is something you've seen all the time, where if you give a seed enough water, enough warmth, a little bit of light, starting with dark, but eventually some light, it will grow into a plant. And the same could be said of barley. If you take barley, give it water, a little bit of warmth, it'll start to grow. The key is we don't want this to fully become a plant. We want to stop it from using that starch because we want to turn that starch into sugar. We want to kill it before it becomes that grass. And the way you do that is by spreading it out across a large room like this and then lighting a fire underneath it. And that's where this peat kiln comes in. And in other parts of the world, you don't necessarily have peat, so you're using other ways of cooking this barley. But this is what you're doing in order to convert this starch into sugar, because the plant naturally will start producing the enzymes to convert the starch inside itself into sugar so it can start eating it to become that plant, and we're just going to stop it by heating it up. So when we talk about scotch, even though peat is the primarily flavor characteristic that we used to talk to about to people when we're saying, hey, what kind of scotch do you want? The key to understanding Scotch whiskey or whiskey at large is to understand this malting process, because every grain, in order to turn it into alcohol, it needs to first be converted into sugar, and that process is done through malting. And that malting process, you either would use something like peat or something like, let's say, steam that doesn't have a flavor and creates a different flavored product at the end. So this barley, as it's being malted, what's actually happening is that the barley is producing an enzyme called amylase. And amylase takes that complex starch, and starch really is a bunch of smaller sugar molecules locking arms with each other so that they become this longer strand, which we call a starch or a carbohydrate. And this amylase enzyme comes along, and it's like a selective biological scissor that finds the right pattern that it can fit with, and it cuts in between these linked chains of sugars so that they become these smaller sugars. So in the case of barley, what you're going to end up with is what we call maltose, and hence malting. If you've ever had a malted milkshake, what you're really having is you're having a milkshake where they've added malt sugar powder, which comes from barley. So when we talk about shochu, there's a lot of things that are not barley. Most of it's not barley. And these things that are not barley, even the things that are starches or grains that have starch, they don't go through the same type of malting process. And we don't use that same process to convert that starch into sugar because it is very ineffective. So if you take something like rice as an example, if you were to put rice in water and try to grow it, it doesn't produce amylase in the same way. And just because of the way that rice is and the fact that it grows underwater as opposed to barley, which doesn't grow in water, it is going to have a very different chemical cycle in terms of converting that starch into sugar into something that is useful. So, since the ingredients that you would use to make shochu don't go through that traditional malting process that we know in the West, well, you need to find another way of converting that starch into sugar, especially when you have something like sweet potato or chestnuts, which contain sugar, but it's not a grain. It's not something that we think about as in that malting sense. So, if you wanted to do this, one way you could do it is you could just add amylase powder, amylase liquid. It is possible today, thanks to science, where we have this concentrated amylase that you can buy to do that conversion. But back in the day, where were you going to get it? Well, people figured out that there was this mold, Koji, and Koji produced the same enzyme. So, as a mold, as a living thing, it needs to digest things. It needs to break things down into smaller pieces, just like any other living organism. And in order to do that, it would produce this amylase enzyme. And people figured out that you could take that Koji and you can then mix it with other things, and that amylase would continue to break it down. So this is similar to whiskey as well, in that most whiskeys don't use 100% malted barley because that's very expensive. They'll take some portion of malted barley and then they'll mix that with unmalted barley, and the amylase from the malted portion will continue to break down that unmalted barley so that it could be cheaper in terms of producing whiskey. If you're interested in this, I would look deeper into Irish whiskeys. Irish whiskeys, there's a long history of trying to avoid paying taxes as well, and there are different taxes for malted versus unmalted barley, and so over the years, different products will have a different blend of malted and unmalted barley, just for cost-saving reasons. So, coming back though to shochu and looking at this Koji, well, you don't need Koji when you're talking about sugarcane because it's already sugar. But as a category, the thing that makes shochu a category really is, besides the fact that it comes from Japan, from Kyushu and the Ryukyu Islands, is the fact that all of them have Koji in it. So if you were to say what is the uniting characteristic of all shochus, it's in fact actually Koji. So even when it comes to something that is 100% sugar to begin with, we're still going to be adding Koji to it, if nothing else, because you want to add the Koji flavor to it. When we talk about Koji flavor, what does that actually mean? Well, the special thing about Koji is that unlike with just malting, where you're producing primarily amylase, which breaks down that starch into sugar, you're also going to be creating something called protease. Protease is another enzyme that breaks protein down into amino acids. And this is why when we think about something like soy sauce or miso, we think about it being savory. We think about umami as a flavor, because the flavor of umami, of glutamic acid, liquid seaweed, as some of us like to call it, or crystallized seaweed, as we like to call it, is actually an amino acid. So if you want to concentrate that, what you need to do is you need to break down protein. And the way you do that is with protease. And Koji produces it in abundance. So besides just breaking starch into sugar, you're actually going to be adding an umami element to all of the different products here, because you're doing it with Koji. And this is why there's so many other people outside of Japan that are suddenly interested in producing a spirit using Koji, or using Koji in other things. Chefs today are using it as a way of speeding up the dry aging of meat process. They're using it in doing charcuterie to draw out more of that very old aged prosciutto flavors. And the way they're getting there, instead of time, they're speeding it up by using the protease enzyme that Koji produces. So now we know why. Let's talk about how and the Koji process. So in order to grow Koji, you need to have an environment that Koji wants to live in. And like all living things, it can't be something that is dry. It needs to be something that is moist. And so the first step to making koji, it has to do with steaming. And you're going to take a grain. In this case, we're taking rice. We're going to steam it. We're going to cook it so that now the koji has a place to live, something to eat, and a way to grow. Here's two examples of rice. It's a little difficult to see in this photo, but they are polished. If you're familiar with how sake works, meaning that the rice has been the outer layers of the rice has been removed. You get to the center, which tends to be the most rich in starch. So in this example here, you can see the 100% rice where you still have that outer brown rice bran layer, and then more and more polishing till you get to that very bright white center that is the full starch. And depending on how much you polish the rice, the koji will be able to get deeper into it. Even if you don't polish the rice, though, the way that you facilitate koji getting to the center of the rice has to do with how moist you can make that rice. By cooking it properly and making sure that there's moisture all the way through to the center of the rice so that it's not crunchy where you eat it, you can get koji to grow all the way into the center of the rice. A very important part of this process. Now, once you've steamed the rice, now it's you need to spread it out. You need to cool it down because it's too hot for the koji to live. So usually they'll just start spreading it out and using a big paddle in their hands across a big table, using clean cloths to line the table. And once you've got it spread out, you will then move this into a room that is specially designed just for koji because you don't want other molds to get on here. You really want this to be a protected space. Often you may hear in other distilleries that they have a proprietary yeast, or they don't use any added yeast. It's the yeast that comes from the air. Because they produce so much of the product, the air is so full of this one yeast that it is just always there ready for them. Well, in some soy sauce factories, they will never move, they'll never expand their operations because they believe that the koji that is in the walls, in the rafters, in the beams, that's just in the air is so unique to their product that they can't move anywhere. And it would take hundreds of years to build up enough koji in the atmosphere just around it so that it wouldn't compete with other things to produce that same soy sauce. So when making shochu, you'll take that rice, you'll spread it out, and then you'll bring it into a room specifically for the koji, and then you'll start sprinkling the top of the rice with those spores. And this is quite literally just a glass cup with kind of like a tissue over it, and those dots you see are the spores. Now, making koji is incredibly complicated, especially if you wanted to just get those spores and not have any other spores. And it really does create you really need to create a laboratory clean room situation to do this. And no distillery can do this on their own. So everyone just buys koji from, at this point, about two major koji houses. And although I make it sound like it is this sterile lab, which it is today, these are businesses that have been in operation for hundreds of years. So at one point, it wasn't as sterile of a stainless steel lab as you're imagining now. At one point, it was really rooms of just wooden bins. But they're the ones who managed to stay in business, who managed to keep doing it, and they're the ones that everyone buys koji from today. And if you're interested in this, you could actually go online today, and if you just went to Amazon, you can buy koji. And as I mentioned, you can buy miso koji in order to dry age steaks. That's a thing that people are really doing, and you can get it delivered to you, next day if you have Prime. But making koji again, you're going to sprinkle this over the rice, and then different people have a different process at this point, where some people will swaddle this rice into little bundles and let it incubate over time. But it takes roughly 72 hours for that koji to fully grow. And the most common traditional way of doing it is actually to break up that rice and to put it into little bins. Now, each of those bins along that wall there is a tray that will hold that amount of rice. And the reason why you want it in this bin is because in order to have the koji grow uniformly over all of the rice, you need to keep moving the rice around This will not only move the rice so that the spores can touch every part of the rice, but it also will make sure that you have the right amount of humidity, and you'll also make sure, which is to say, enough humidity, but also not too much humidity, and that you can move this rice around. So before industrial machines could do this, the easiest way to do this was to keep it on a tray, and then you would come in and you would toss this tray. So this distiller, one batch of koji would take up one side of the wall here, and this would mean that once he starts this process, every 3 or 4 hours for the next 72 hours, he needs to come back and work through all of those trays. He said that it takes him about half an hour at this point, because he's done it so much, to get through all the trays and rotate that rice. Then he'll go off to do something else, and a few hours later he'll have to come back and do it again. And at most he'll do 2 sides of the room at once, to do this. So this is the traditional way of doing it, but people have started scaling this up. And even in this traditional process, you're still talking about quite a lot of rice, so more than a rice cooker at home. But they've really scaled this up to the point where this is a rice steamer that is big enough that it can take an entire 18-wheeler of rice and steam it at once. And if you take this much rice, well, how do you turn that into koji? Well, there are also industrial machines that can do the entire koji process. And in this kind of A-frame tent-shaped machine, there are trays that you fill with that steamed rice, and those are 2 temperature probes you see inside. This one is currently not in operation, and so you would fill that with rice. You would the steamed rice. You'd spread the spores over it, and then the machine would monitor the temperature and the humidity, and it would regulate it so that it would grow the koji. The more advanced machines are round and actually will rotate the koji as well. So quite amazing how industrialized this process has become. But in talking about koji, it's not just one koji, it's actually 3 different kinds of koji. There are 3. There's yellow, there's black, and there's white. And I said the colors correspond to the color of the spores. And when we talk about these 3 different kojis, the reason why you have 3 is because they all actually taste very different. So when you're purchasing a shochu or you're trying one of the key questions to ask, besides where is this from, what is it made from, the next question is, what kind of koji is this? Because that will tell you a lot about what you're tasting. And this is the simplified answer of how things taste. But this doesn't answer the question of why shochu is made with koji and what this has to do with the Professor Oak versus Birch and the different parts of Japan. The answer to this has to do with the family history of koji. The first koji really is yellow koji. Yellow koji is the earlier genetic version of koji, and it is the koji that is used to make sake. Sake koji, if you want to call it that, or rice koji, if you want to call it that, it's got this lighter fruity flavors, and if you think of the different flavors you can get in sake, that is the kind of flavors you're going to get out of yellow koji. Now, as you move to the 2 newer forms of koji that were isolated much more recently, you have black koji and you have white koji. Now, black koji, when I say recently, it's still a couple hundred years old. White koji is very, very new, and it's in the last 50 or 60 years, I believe. So it is a fairly new product. But black koji produces citric acid, and this is the key to understanding why shochu is made down in the South. Now, if you think about pre-refrigeration, think hundreds of years ago, before modern refrigeration, how did we preserve food before you can keep it cold? Well, one of the ways you did it was by selective or a controlled spoilage, if you will. One of those ways, let's say, is you take milk. If you have too much milk when the cows are producing and you want to store it, what do? You turn it into cheese. You let the milk go bad in the right way and you get cheese. Well, what about vegetables? Well, if you want to store vegetables, what you can do is you can pickle them. And when you talk about pickling, the gold standard, the traditional pickle, is the lactic fermentation. And what is lactic? Lactic is the lactic acid that we're talking about. And the reason why this is important in pickling is that the acid prevents the bad bacteria that would otherwise make your pickle spoil. So by promoting the lactic acid bacteria in your pickles, you're able to make them sour from that lactic acid. This is where things like sauerkraut or sour pickles come from. It is that protects that pickle from actually being invaded by other bacteria. And so, if you imagine in Japan, at some point in the past, you have in the north, it is much cooler. And so you don't have to worry about bacteria quite as much. For those of us that work in restaurants and bars, we've all had to take some kind of health and safety test to get a food handler's license. And the key thing there is it's about the danger zone. It's about getting things cold enough or hot enough that you're not going to have bacterial growth. And so in the north, things were cold enough that if you were to brew sake, it wouldn't go bad because it wouldn't be invaded by these bad bacteria. But as you go further south to the island of Kyushu, now you have a warmer climate. And at the period where you're doing the harvest, you're bringing in all this grain and you want to turn it into alcohol, it's too warm compared to the north. And if you were to start brewing using just that yellow koji, what would happen is that it would be invaded by other bad bacteria. But much like utilizing the lactic acid bacteria to make your pickles, people noticed that if you took black koji and more recently white koji, it would produce citric acid as opposed to lactic acid, and that acid would protect that brew. It would protect it from being invaded by these bad bacteria. Now, the problem though is now it's very acidic. And while some of us like to drink pickle brine, when you think about a super sour pickle brine, not the vinegary brine, but the sauerkraut kind of lactic acid brine, it tends to be kind of off-putting. And when we talk about, how much citric acid is this black koji producing, I'm talking about like, as acidic as, a lemon or a lime. So fairly acidic. So if you were to make a brew using a black koji as opposed to yellow koji, great, it is now protected. It does not have to worry about a bacterial infection, but now it's too acidic to drink. You don't want to drink something that is as sour as a lemon or a lime. So what can we do? Well, the answer is you can distill it. And by distilling it, you're able to separate the acid from the alcohol, and you're able to produce a product that you can now drink, which is why in the north, sake produced from yellow koji is not distilled for the most part. And then in the south, where you can't use that yellow koji, or you can now thanks to modern refrigeration and techniques, but historically was more difficult unless you were, at the top of a mountain or in a very specific region, you would have to rely on the black koji with citric acid. You couldn't just drink that straight, and so you would then turn to distillation as a way of removing that citric acid. Which nicely brings up to the next section of understanding shochu, which is distillation. Now, when it comes to other categories, we tend to divide distillation into two main things. And, most people think about distillation as being, a pot distilled thing and a continuous distilled thing. And I mentioned earlier, we're not really going to talk about continuous distilled. So if everything is pot distilled, well, what are the different ways of distillation when trying to understand shochu? And this is another way in which shochu is very different from any other category of spirit out there. The two different types of distillation that we're going to be thinking about in understanding shochu is atmospheric pressure or regular pressure distillation, joatsu, or reduced pressure or vacuum distillation, genatsu. So for most of us, when we think about distillation, you're probably thinking about something like this, or you're probably thinking about a still that looks like this. This is the most common style of stills that get popularized when talking about distilled spirits. No one romanticizes a column still. Everyone thinks about pot stills like cognac stills or whiskey stills like this. So if you go to Japan and you visit these shochu distilleries, you're going to see something different. You're going to see something that looks like this. And if I were to say, like, what is this, what are these two things you're looking at? Some people might say, oh, this is probably a pot still, that's a column still. It looks like a column, right? Some of you maybe are saying, this is a trick question. He just said that it's not pot and column, it's atmospheric pressure and reduced pressure. Uh, Wrong. That's a trick question. It's actually the same still. This is one still. This is the still that is used to make both types of shochu because you can use it by turning on a vacuum and doing reduced pressure, or you can turn off the vacuum and have regular pressure distillation. So most common still type in Japan for shochu distillation looks something like this. Bigger, smaller, wider, a little bit different, but they most commonly look like this. So what is this, and what is this, when we say atmospheric pressure versus reduced pressure? What are we talking about here? And again, like in the other categories, we're going to take a step back and we're going to look at what is distillation and how does this relate to shochu. So for most people, if you took a non-industry person, you said, what is distillation? You might come up with something vague like you're going to turn beer or wine into a more concentrated alcohol. And while this is true, this is not a good definition because one way that you could concentrate alcohol is by freezing it. So if you take something that has a small amount of alcohol, like beer or wine, if it got cold enough, the water part of it would freeze, and this is called fractional freezing, and it's different from distillation. The problem with this is that while you could remove the water part of a beer or wine and then get more alcohol, there's other things besides just water in this brewed product. And in its unconcentrated state, you could drink something like a beer or wine and be fine because you're not having a lot of it. But once you start concentrating it, you're going to start concentrating the not good parts of it as well. Specifically, you're going to be concentrating things like methanol, which, if you have too much, will make you go blind. Now, when we're talking about distillation, though, we're not talking about that lower temperature end of the spectrum. We're talking about the higher temperature end of that spectrum. And what we're doing is we're separating things by boiling point. And it's quite literally, you can think of it as boiling a kettle of water. Water, to make things simple and round numbers, we'll talk about it in Celsius, boils at 100 degrees Celsius. And this is a really easy way to think about it because alcohol compared to water boils at 78.4 degrees Celsius. This means that, just as if we take water, 100% water in a kettle, we turn on the heat. As it starts boiling, the water will turn into steam and start coming out. We can collect that steam. That is the concentrated water. That is distilled water, right? Now, if we took beer or wine and we slowly started heating it up, before it gets to 100, so water is not yet going to boil, you can get to a temperature where you're boiling the alcohol and you're able to remove the alcohol from the water phase. Now, the nice thing that happens to work for us is that things like methanol or acetone, the things you don't want to drink and don't want to concentrate, happen to boil at an even lower temperature. So often you've probably heard the term the heads, the heart, and the tail of a distillation. The heads, the first part of the distillate that comes off, that's going to have the methanol, and you can remove that. You can make that first cut, remove the heads, take the heart, the center of the distillation that has all of that good, delicious ethanol, and then by the time you get to the tail, that's where all that remaining water is. If you think about a very simplified, diagram of a still, you can take something like this. It is like that kettle. You're just adding heat to it. The vapor comes off. It's going to go down. You're going to cool it, and you're going to get that distillate. And then by making those cuts, you're able to separate out the different parts of that alcohol. Now, when we say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius and alcohol boils at 78, we're leaving out a key part of this sentence, of both of these sentences. We're talking about water boiling at 100 degrees at sea level. Perhaps you've experienced this. You've gone camping high up into the mountains and you're going to boil water, and it takes a lot longer to cook your food. It takes shorter to boil the water, but the food doesn't cook as quickly. Water boils faster, food takes longer to cook. What's happening here? Well, The boiling point of water has to do with the elevation because at different elevations you have different amounts of pressure. The way to think about this is that if you imagine a cup of water, there is an amount of force being pressed down on it. And for the water to turn into steam, it has to overcome that force. Now, imagine wherever you are, from the top of your head to the top of space, there's a stack of air. And if you are at the top of a mountain, if you're at the top of Mount Everest, there's less air above you. And if you are down near the ocean or even below the ocean, there's going to be more stuff between you and the edge of space. You know, you've heard the term training at elevation. If you're an athlete, let's say you're going to try to run a marathon and you want to have an easier time during the competition, you can train at a higher elevation where there's less oxygen so that when you actually finally do the marathon at a lower elevation where there's more oxygen, it's going to be easier for you to do it. Or conversely, you may hear of mountain climbers, someone going to the top of Mount Everest, and they're taking canisters of oxygen with them. They're having elevation sickness. If someone's going to Machu Picchu, they start getting dizzy because there's not enough air. The air is literally thinner. There's less of it there. So if you imagine, the higher up you go, there's literally less air above you. So imagine that same cup of water at the top of Mount Everest, there is much less than half of the air that you would have than were you at sea level. So for that water to turn into steam, it takes a lot less energy the higher up you go, and you'll have a lower boiling point. So the water is still boiling, but the temperature is much lower. If you don't want to do all your distillation at the top of a mountain, though, what can you do? You can lower the pressure artificially by creating a vacuum. And by lowering that pressure, going up and down on this graph, you can see that the temperature gets lower and lower. And so you can separate things by temperature. At a lower temperature, the lower the pressure goes. And for most of us, you've probably heard of something called a rotary evaporator, a rotovap. A lot of people think that this is a cool way of doing distillation, at a bar. If you just want to do distillation, don't buy this. Just buy a still. They're much cheaper and they're much easier to run. The real benefit of a rotovap is the fact that you get to do it at a vacuum. And so in a traditional still, you're applying heat and you need to get that alcohol up to 78 degrees Celsius. And by raising the temperature, you are effectively cooking what's inside it. And what happens when you raise the temperature and you cook something? Well, you're going to change it. If you think about food, you have something, let's say like browning, like the Maillard reaction. You're changing the chemicals from one thing into another thing. You're taking sugar and you're turning it into caramel, or you're literally breaking them apart into smaller things that are different, things that you might not want, or maybe it's literally just evaporating away. And so you don't get it at all because it stays in its vapor form and it's gone. You've lost that thing. So by lowering the temperature, you don't do any of this cooking. So you're able to get a more raw or natural, if you want to think of it, flavor out of it by not changing the flavor through heat. In shochu production, what we think of this laboratory small scale distillation setup, they've just scaled up into this large still. And you're able to produce alcohol in two different ways. You can do it at regular pressure, as if there was no vacuum, or at this reduced pressure. So what does this do in terms of the actual taste of shochu? We're looking at two different styles, really. So the thing that's coming out of the atmospheric regular pressure distillation is going to be much more rich. It's going to be oilier. It's going to be more complex. And the spirit that's coming off of the reduced pressure still, and you're doing this at about half the temperature now, you're going to get a lighter, more flowery, more floral, more volatile characteristic out of it. So you get really two completely different distillates depending on the pressure or temperature you're going to be doing this distillation at. And that really is what we're talking about when we're talking about these two different kinds of distillation. Now, the last most important thing in terms of understanding shochu as a category is that we need to talk about proof. And, no quizzes this time. I'm just going to give it to you. It's real simple. There's high and there's low. Uh, most shochus tend to be in that lower proof category. And you're going to see things in that mid 20s. It's going to be somewhere between about 24 and 27% alcohol by volume. But it can come, as we saw earlier when we were talking about Honkaku Shochu, much higher, much closer to the other spirits you're more used to. And if you're looking for that higher proof shochu, you're going to be looking for something called genshu, which means raw or undiluted. So we're talking about shochu that is distilled to proof. No water is being added to it. It's not being, made more distilled and then you're watering it back down to something. We're talking about just stopping the distillation where you want it to be, and we're talking about stopping at somewhere over 36% alcohol by volume. That is genshu. So if you're looking for something that is, more concentrated, then look for a genshu. But for the most part, shochu, just because this is what people in Japan historically tended to drink, tends to come at that lower proof. Part of this has to do with just the price of shochu and the way that it's taxed. It's cheaper to buy a lower proof shochu in Japan than it is to buy a higher proof shochu. And this is not just a Japanese thing. This is true all around the world. There are many spirits where, if you look, they're starting to sell a 38% version rather than a 40% version because it just is less taxes. They charge you the same amount, and then the corporations just want to make more money. So in shochu, though, look for genshu if you're looking for a higher proof, but just know that most of what you're going to see out there is going to be in that lower proof category. Thing to think about, really, though, is this is an interesting challenge and an opportunity in terms of what to do with shochu when you're making a cocktail. Because for many of us, we tend to think of, that Mr. Potato Head. I have a formula that works for this style of cocktail, and I just want to plug and play. I'm going to remove the bourbon. I'm going to put in a rye. I'm going to take out the tequila. I'm going to use a mezcal, or even across categories. I'm going to take that gin and I'm going to turn it into a whiskey, but you're using that same ratio. Well, when it comes to shochu, it is a different proof. So you really need to rethink those recipes. And rather than this being as a difficult thing, I think of this as an interesting way of working with these different lighter flavors, but also as an opportunity to expand that lower proof portion of the menu where so many of your guests today are looking to find something that is a little more low octane. They're not looking, for that full alcohol. They want that low ABV. They want that no ABV. Shochu is a great way to work in that low ABV category, but still be working at full flavor of that distilled spirit that's coming out of that bottle. On that note, in terms of how shochu is drunk in Japan, broadly speaking, the main ways that it tends to be drunk is straight on the rocks, which doesn't require much explanation, and then two different formats with water, either with cold water or with hot water. And you may have heard of the mizuwari, the with water, as the in terms of Japanese whiskeys, where you add a large amount of water compared to how a Western whiskey drinker might drink. So you're kind of getting more into the highball range of liquid, of water added to whiskey. But you can do that also with shochu, and that is a very common way of drinking shochu. And then also with hot water, and this tends to be somewhere in the about like 3-to-1 ratio of hot water to shochu, especially with that lower proof shochu. That hot water really opens it up. It really changes that nose and really gives you an opportunity to smell all of that shochu, get all of those umami notes out of it. If you've never tried it before, I highly recommend you try drinking all of your shochus at one point, oyuwari. And in Japan, one of the most interesting things was going to a lot of these restaurants with distillers. They would even take the broth from doing like a sukiyaki or from other broths that we were having at the restaurant, and they would just add that light broth to the shochu, and they would have this warm shochu broth. It is quite delicious. Now, before we end this session, we're going to talk about some of the other things to consider when talking about shochu that are this is the bonus. We're in bonus time now. This is the all the other stuff that we're not going to get into detail, but we just want to mention. So we talked about Koji and the fact that it is the key to understanding the whole category and that it is everywhere, but it's even more complicated than that. It's not just that there's three kinds of Koji that's in everything. Every Koji needs to grow in something. So that means that in that Kokuto Shochu, when you grow the Koji, you're not going to grow the Koji on Kokuto. You need to grow it on something else. So even the sugarcane Shochu mostly to some degree contains rice because they tend to grow it on rice. So it is a mixture of rice and Koji and sugarcane. In the case of one of the GIs in the Iki on Iki Island, it is mandated that they use barley, that they use rice Koji, not barley Koji. You have to use rice Koji, and you have to mix it specifically in a ratio of 2 parts barley to 1 part rice Koji. So you could make barley shochu with barley Koji. You can make it with rice Koji, and you could have different ratios. In fact, this is one of the few things that you can actually try in the US today. Because unfortunately, there are so many different kinds of shochu in Japan. Most of it doesn't even leave Kyushu. Most of it doesn't even make it up to Tokyo. And most of it definitely does not make it to the US. And all the interesting things, sadly, you're going to have to go to Japan to try. But you can try different kinds of Koji ratios in a product from one company. And oddly enough, it happens to be one that's readily available today. Thus far, I haven't talked about specific brands, and I will now that we're in this bonus section. For Ichiko, very often you'll see that there's 2 Ichikos. There's this older Saitan product you may see if you go to an izakaya, and they've been marketing the Ichiko Silhouette. This is an incorrect slide. It should be Silhouette, not Saitan. The taller bottle is the Ichiko Saitan, which is now being marketed more towards cocktail bars. But this older squat Silhouette bottle, they really just talk about it as being a lower proof. And if you ask more deeply, they'll tell you that it is that reduced pressure distillation. So you're like, aha, I can try these 2 products. If I lower the ABV of Ichiko Saitan, I can try the atmospheric distillation versus reduced pressure distillation. Sadly, that's not the case because it's not just that, and they do in fact have the same Koji. They do in fact have the same barley Koji, but what they don't tell you is that Ichiko Saitan is 100% barley Koji. They do not add any non-Koji to Ichiko Saitan. Whereas Ichiko Silhouette, and again, apologies for the incorrect label here, the shorter bottle closer to me is Ichiko Silhouette. That is actually 75% raw barley, or steamed cooked barley, but raw in the sense it has no Koji, 25% barley Koji. So you can taste that mix of barley and barley Koji, and you can also taste the difference of the distillation technique. If you got a third barley shochu, one that is with a different Koji, you can start really mixing and matching in this category. In fact, there is, I believe, a third Ichiko that you can get in the US if you really want to go well within a product from one distillery. Now, we mentioned still types, and we just talked about distillation from a reduced pressure versus an atmospheric pressure, but there's also many different types of still. This, some of you may recognize as being a older Asian or South Asian style still, sometimes referred to as a Filipino style still. It's something that maybe you know as one of the ways that they're still producing mezcal today in Mexico. And there are distilleries where they're using all clay, so there's no metal touching the alcohol, and it makes a very different process. So if you've had Minero from the Del Maguey family, that is all done in clay pots using this type of still. In Japan, this is the traditional style of distillation, and there are people still doing this style of distillation. There's a distillery called Oishi that is doing this older style of distillation to this day. Often, though, when we talk about more industrial stills, this is the same type of still I showed you earlier. There can be smaller stills, there can be larger stills, different sizes, different shapes of that swan's neck and of the where the reflux happens. So you get different kinds of distillates, but every distillery is very unique in that there is no rule and there is no one company producing all these stills. So everyone is really cobbling this together in their own way. And there are just wild designs of stills that I've never seen anywhere else. In fact, there is a distillery that has a horizontal still that has four swan's necks coming off the top of it. This is the Komasa distillery. Uh, I've never seen anything like this. This is a sweet potato distillate made with rice koji. It's wild. This product is available in the U.S. It is very oily and rich just because of the style of still. So whereas a taller still gives you that lighter, more delicate product, they've intentionally made the squattest still possible by making it longer and then putting four line arms off the top of it. So wild. And even within the distillation, they're doing interesting things. So in this older style still, traditionally, instead of heating it with something like steam, it would be direct fired. So here you can see there's this little hole underneath where you would put in sticks and that you would set on fire, and it would directly heat that chamber above it. Now, in that modern version I showed you, that box underneath is a steam box, and most people tend to move the steam because by going to steam, even in the Western like whiskey stills, they tend to move to a coil of steam going through it because this gives you very consistent heating, and you don't have to worry about burning. And in fact, in that Western style still, if you are using direct fire, often you'll have this thing on the bottom that's agitating the wort in whiskey, the fermented product in or the beer, if you will. Often this is called a rummager, and it's like a chainmail. And they'll often use something like copper, and it'll be running around on the bottom of the still to prevent scorching. Think of it like when you're making a risotto or a stew, and you want to stir it so it doesn't burn on the bottom. Well, what if you intentionally let it burn and you make a burned, that roasted flavored product? There's a shochu from the Yanagita distillery where they are intentionally burning the fermented product in order to get a toasted flavor out of it. So they normally make something called aokage. This is the aokage 41 genshu, and it specifically, they allow it to burn during the distillation process, and the otherwise barley shochu comes out in a very toasted flavor. Super interesting product, so different. Now, the thing that everyone always wants to know about, coming from the West, is they want to know, is there, how do you age this? Is there an older product? Because everyone associates older, time in wood with higher quality. I suggest you move away from that and trying to understand shochu, and just in general, older doesn't always mean better, it just means different. But are going to be allowing shochu to mature to some degree, and like many spirits, you're going to allow it to rest to some degree in something like stainless steel. But more traditionally, you're going to rest it in enamel. So in the mid-sized distilleries in Japan, you're going to see a lot of enamel tanks holding shochu, and more traditionally than that, you're going to see clay vessels. And this is a distillery where they're aging their shochu in a cave. There is one distillery where it is a historic gold mine that has a literal train that you can ride down multiple stories underground that they've started using to age their shochus. But there are people who are aging it in wood. Unfortunately, many of these products aren't available in the US, and there is actually quite a bit of debate in Japan as to what to do about this. On the one hand, you have someone like this gentleman from the Toyonaga distillery, and he has been doing this all his life. He's been doing this for generations. He specifically is in love with whiskeys, and so he's been importing barrels from Scotland and has created a room to mimic the atmosphere and the temperature and humidity of Scotland to try to do that style of barrel aging. However, there are some less scrupulous, let's say, newcomers to the shochu industry who are trying to make a quick buck and trying to ride the coattails of the Japanese whiskey boom, and they're trying to make a barrel-aged shochu product. But at the moment, once it gets to a certain amount of color, they will no longer consider it a shochu. So the bottle on the lighter bottle here you can see is definitely still considered shochu. That darker one is borderline. If it's been around long enough, they'll let it go. But if someone comes with a new product that's very dark, it'll be difficult to actually to call that shochu. And this is to protect not only the shochu industry, who wants to stay traditional, but also does not want to be taxed at the same rate as the Japanese whiskey industry. And the Japanese whiskey industry also does not want to confuse the product by bringing in all this other stuff that is not Japanese whiskey. But two products that are available in the U.S. If you're looking for something that is what is it? Barrel aged. There are some other things. The Mugon, specifically from the Sengetsu distillery, probably the easiest one that you're going to find that's going to have a good amount of oak to it. Now, earlier I showed this picture and I just kind of glossed over it as stainless steel as being a holding tank. But if you look further back, there's some weird little black things, pressed against this tank. This is a distillery in Amami Island where they do that sugarcane shochu, the Kokuto shochu, and here they're doing a acoustic aging, and they are subjecting this shochu to speakers, and they're listening to classical music. This was the playlist when we visited, and if you're curious about this, the product is called Lento. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and it actually gets even more complicated. This is an etc. sign behind my head. Even within the things we already talked about, let's say in rice, we mentioned, not only the types of rice, but the grades of polishing. But there are many, many varieties of that just within the Japanese rice. So the most well-known is the koshihikari, which is a type of table rice that you can buy even in the U.S. Just for eating. But there are many sub-varieties from that strain that are used in shochu production. Furthermore, even in things like barley, specific distilleries will create their own sub-varietals. So this is a 4-row and 2-row barley. So 4-row barley was specifically created by the Sanwa distillery. That's the makers of Ichiko, and they have their own proprietary variety of barley that they use. We talked about sweet potato, and for the most part, when we talk about sweet potato shochu, it is the white outside, white inside Kogane Sengan sweet potato. But there are all sorts of varieties of sweet potatoes, different colors of both skin and of the flesh, and they all completely taste different. Something that we did not talk about at all was the brewing process and how they mix different ratios of water with koji and the ingredient, and that goes through multiple rounds of brewing. This is done at various different production scales. If we try to scale this old man that is stirring a 10-liter pot to this industrial scale, it would be this tiny. The old man's entire production could fit in one of these tanks. So this is obviously going to make a completely different product. So there's just so much when it comes to shochu that it is kind of staggering when you really want to get geeky about it and really dive deeply into this category. But because there's so much, I encourage you, at least initially, when you start thinking about shochu, narrow things down. Even with this, we're still talking about a lot. So if you break things down to just the 5 main ingredients for shochu, the 3 types of koji, the 2 types of distillation, and the 2 different proofs, you're already talking about 60 different possible combinations. It would be difficult to do a single tasting where we can go through all of this. So the better way to do this is to break things down into more manageable chunks if you can. If you have the ability to go out and source these products and you're going to try it, I would suggest that you start with one thing at a time. Let's say you want to understand koji more. So let's pick one ingredient. Let's take barley. Let's get 3 different kinds of koji, all from that same barley, and then let's put it through one type of distillation, one proof, and then let's do a tasting of just that. Or if you want to be a little bit more broad, you can say, okay, we're going to take sweet potato, we're only going to use black koji, but we're going to do both types of distillation at both proofs. So we can see how the different distillation techniques taste different at different proofs using the same koji and the same base ingredient. Or let's say we're going to take every single ingredient and put it through one koji, one distillation, one proof. You can see this is very interesting, and it's going to give you so many different ways to explore this category. It is really interesting, and it's so much fun to really just, even in this basic 101 way of exploring shochu, to spend a lot of time and have a lot of fun out there. So I encourage you to go out there and do your own experiments, taste a bunch of shochus, try playing with it in cocktails. If you're interested in learning some more, here's some suggestions of good websites. JSS's website is shochu.guide. It has a lot of great information, both on production as well as specific products and distributors that you can get them from the US. There are a couple of distribution websites, MTC Sake and Skurnik. They both have great websites that have all the information that you want to get about shochu. Unfortunately, when you go to a lot of websites and you're looking for information about shochu, they'll just tell you one thing. It'll just say, oh, this is a rice shochu. It won't tell you the distillation type. It won't tell you the koji type. It's really a struggle to get all that information. The other great website is kanpai.us, which is a couple of Japanese bartenders and enthusiasts, and they've been reviewing shochu for a while. It's a great website, and I believe that they have a podcast as well called Japan Distilled. Highly suggest you check that out if you're interested in shochu. And if you remember nothing else, remember that Dr. Oak, Professor Oak, he drinks sake, Professor Birch drinks shochu, and that this is the understanding shochu and the various variables when you want to think about shochu and really understand it and really get to know it rather than just understand it as a thing that you learn for a test. Here's how to really think about it and to be able to explain it to others. If you're interested in learning more or have questions, I can be reached on the various social medias. And for more videos like this, I'll continue to start putting out other videos explaining categories and other topics in cocktails if you're interested. Thank you.